she said. "Don't look at me like that." I smiled because I'd already noticed she never stopped looking back. It started in the simplest way. A late afternoon that should have been forgettable. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of silence where even the rustle of leaves felt louder than it should. I had stepped outside just to breathe, to stretch out the stiffness of the day. That's when I saw her again. She wasn't doing anything remarkable, just tending to the small row of plants that lined the edge of her porch. A watering can tilted gracefully in her hand, droplets sliding over green leaves, catching the sunlight before they fell into the soil. Ordinary maybe to anyone else, but there was something about the way she carried herself. Even in the plainest tasks she looked complete. Not trying, not performing. Just existing with a quiet grace that made the air feel different. I'd noticed her before, of course. Living next door, it was impossible not to. But this time I didn't just notice. I lingered. Her hair slipped forward, a strand brushing across her cheek as she leaned down toward the plants. Without thinking, she tucked it behind her ear. That small, instinctive movement that felt almost too intimate for me to witness. The sunlight traced her profile, softening the lines of her face in a way that pulled me in. She wasn't trying to be beautiful. That's what made her impossible to ignore. For a second, I let myself look too long. I thought I was subtle, thought I could get away with it. But she turned, not suddenly, just enough to catch me. Our eyes met across the narrow strip of lawn that divided her world from mine. It wasn't the first time our eyes had crossed, but it was the first time neither of us looked away immediately. Her gaze held mine, steady but unreadable. It wasn't hostile. It wasn't warm either. It was something else, like she was weighing me, testing the silence between us. The moment stretched. My chest tightened, though I couldn't say why. I should have broken it. Should have glanced down at my shoes or pretended to check my phone. But I didn't. And then the faintest curve of her lips. Not a smile, not exactly. More like acknowledgement. A flicker that said she saw me, not just as the kid next door, but as a man standing there, holding his gaze too long. I swallowed hard, suddenly aware of the hum of the cicadas in the trees, the warm scent of soil and jasmine drifting from her garden. Everything around me sharpened, as if the world itself wanted me to remember this second. She turned back to her plants as though nothing had happened, but I could feel the echo of her glance still pressing against me. My pulse hadn't quite steadied when I finally shifted my weight and went back inside. That was the first spark. Not fireworks, not lightning. Just a glance held a few beats longer than it should have been. But sometimes that's enough to change everything. The next time we spoke, it wasn't planned. It never is with neighbors. You just cross paths, and suddenly there's a moment that wasn't there before. I was stepping out to grab the mail, still half distracted by the weight of the day. She was already outside, leaning lightly against the wooden rail of her porch. The watering can was gone, replaced with a coffee mug she held close, like it wasn't just keeping her hands warm but also giving her something to do. Our eyes caught again, quick but deliberate this time. She tilted her head slightly, like she'd been expecting me to look her way. Maybe I had. "You know," she said, her voice calm but edged with something I couldn't quite name. "You really shouldn't look at me like that." The words landed sharper than I expected. Not cruel, just firm. A line drawn in the air between us. For a second I froze. My instinct was to apologize, to retreat into politeness. But something about the way she said it, the way her lips held steady, the way her eyes stayed locked on mine instead of breaking away, told me she wasn't offended. She was challenging me. I felt a smile tug at my mouth before I could stop it. "Then stop looking back," I said, my tone lighter than the pounding in my chest. Her expression faltered, just enough for me to notice. For the briefest moment, she wasn't guarded, wasn't composed. Then she let out a short breath, not quite a laugh but close. She shook her head, sipping her coffee like she needed the pause to steady herself. "That's bold," she murmured, more to the rim of her cup than to me. I shrugged. Though my pulse betrayed the casualness I tried to wear. "Only fair. You set the rules." The air between us shifted then. It wasn't just neighborly small talk anymore. It was something else. Playful, edged with a tension that hummed just beneath the surface. Every word we traded carried more than its weight, like hidden meanings were stitched into the spaces between syllables. For the first time, I noticed the way the breeze carried the faint scent of roasted coffee, mingling with the jasmine still clinging from her garden. The way her fingers tapped once against the mug, restless, though her body looked perfectly still. The way her gaze lingered just a fraction longer than necessary before she looked away. I held on to those details, memorizing them. Because even though her words told me to stop, her presence told me something else. Neighbors talk all the time, about fences, mailboxes, the weather. But this wasn't about any of those things. This was about boundaries, and the fact that we both knew we were already brushing against them. When she finally excused herself and slipped back inside, the moment left a trace behind. The echo of her voice, the challenge in her eyes, the quiet admission in her hesitation. And as I stood there, the envelope in my hand forgotten, I realized something dangerous. The line she had drawn between us made me want to step closer, not back away. It didn't take long for the next excuse to appear. Though looking back, I can't say if it was truly necessity or something she allowed to happen. One evening, just as the light was beginning to fade and the street lamps flickered on, there was a soft knock at my door. Not hurried, not hesitant. 3 calm taps that carried a certain assurance. When I opened it, there she was. "I hate to bother you," she began, her voice carrying that same mix of confidence and restraint. "But could you give me a hand with something?" Her eyes didn't quite meet mine at first. She gestured toward the hallway behind her. "It's silly, really. Just a box I can't lift on my own." Of course I said yes. I didn't even let her finish before I was stepping into her world. A space I'd only glimpsed from a distance. Inside, her home felt exactly like her. Warm, graceful, lived in but carefully kept. The faint scent of vanilla and cedar drifted through the air, soft and grounding. Books stacked neatly on one side. A vase of fresh flowers on the table. Curtains half drawn against the dusk. Everything about the space felt intentional, personal. The box sat in the corner, heavier than it looked. As I crouched to lift it, she hovered near, her hand brushing against mine for just a second as if to steady it. The touch was brief, but it landed with the weight of something unspoken. "You're stronger than you look," she teased, her voice lighter now, as if the act of asking for help had softened her. I smiled, shifting the box into place. Guess I needed a chance to prove it. When I straightened, she was closer than before. Not uncomfortably close, just close enough that I could notice the details. The faint line at the corner of her eye that deepened when she smiled. The warmth of her skin only an arm's length away. The gentle rise and fall of her breathing. For a moment, neither of us moved. The silence wasn't empty. It was full, humming with the awareness of what had just passed between us. I broke it with something safe. "You've made this place feel alive," I said, nodding toward the shelves, the flowers, the careful arrangement of light and color. Her gaze softened, and this time she looked directly at me. "It didn't always," she admitted quietly. "It takes time to make a place feel like home." There was weight in her words, something deeper than just decorating. I wanted to ask more, but I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I found myself standing there longer than I needed to, reluctant to let the moment end. She didn't usher me out either. She just leaned lightly against the edge of the table, arms folded loosely, as if we both knew that the box wasn't the reason she had knocked. And when I finally did step back toward the door, I caught her watching me again. Not the guarded, measured look from before, but something gentler. Something that lingered even after the door closed behind me. That night, lying awake in my own room, I realized it wasn't just the weight of the box I'd carried. It was something else, something I couldn't set down, no matter how much I tried. It was late when I saw her again, not by chance this time, but because I had stepped outside just to breathe the cool night air. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of silence that makes even the faintest sounds carry far. A dog barked in the distance, and somewhere down the street, a door closed gently. She was sitting on her porch, a shawl draped loosely around her shoulders, a glass of wine in her hand. Her posture was relaxed, but her eyes looked far away. I hesitated at first, wondering if I should leave her to the quiet. But before I could decide, she glanced over and caught me standing there. "You're restless too?" she asked, her voice low, almost like she didn't want to disturb the night itself. I walked closer, leaning lightly against the edge of her fence. "Guess so. Couldn't sleep." She nodded, as though she understood without needing more words. For a while we just let the silence stretch. The air was cool, carrying the faint smell of damp grass and night-blooming flowers. I watched her swirl the wine in her glass, the reflection of the porch light flickering in the crimson liquid. Then she spoke softer this time. People think I have it all figured out. Strong, steady, always in control. That's the story everyone wants to believe. She let out a small breath, half a laugh, half a sigh. Truth is, some nights I sit here and wonder if I've just been playing the role too well. Her words caught me off guard. Not because I doubted them, but because she was letting me see the part she kept hidden. The confident woman next door, who always carried herself with such quiet grace, was showing me the cracks in her armor. I didn't rush to answer. I just let her words settle, the weight of them heavier than anything she'd asked me to lift before. Finally I said, "It's easier to pretend sometimes, to be what people expect." Her eyes met mine then, and I saw something shift in them, recognition maybe, or relief. "And what about you?" she asked. "What role are you playing?" I hesitated, then shrugged. "I guess the one where I'm supposed to have everything ahead of me, but half the time I feel like I'm already behind." Her lips parted slightly, as though she hadn't expected me to admit that. For a long moment she didn't say anything. She just looked at me, not with judgment but with the kind of understanding that feels like an embrace. The silence grew heavier, charged. Her hand rested on the arm of the chair, fingers brushing against the wooden frame. I found myself drawn to the movement, to the thought of how close that hand was, how easy it would be to reach across the small space between us. But I didn't. Neither of us did. Instead, we just sat there, our gazes locked longer than either of us intended, the air humming with all the things we didn't say. When she finally looked away, it wasn't rejection. It was surrender to the moment's weight. And for me it was enough. Because in that shared honesty, I felt something shift, a quiet bond forming, not from glances or banter, but from the fragile truth she'd allowed me to see. The night it happened, the sky was heavy with rain. Not a violent storm, just a steady downpour that blurred the world into muted colors and softened the edges of everything. The street lamps flickered against the wet pavement, and the air smelled of earth and rain-soaked leaves. I had just come back from a late errand, water dripping from the edge of my jacket, when I saw her standing by her porch light, peering out at the weather like she was deciding whether to make a run for it. She noticed me before I could speak. "You'll catch cold out here," she called, her voice muffled by the rain. I laughed softly, shaking the water from my hair. Guess I didn't plan ahead. Without hesitation, she waved me over. "Come inside for a bit. No sense in standing out there." I stepped into her home again, the warmth of it wrapping around me instantly. The faint vanilla scent I was beginning to recognize, the soft glow of her lamps against the rain-darkened windows. She closed the door gently behind me, and suddenly the world felt smaller, quieter, as if the storm outside had been shut out entirely. "Here," she said, reaching for a towel and handing it to me. Our fingers brushed, just a second but enough for a spark to catch. "Thanks," I murmured, drying my hair while she moved back toward the living room. She sat down on the edge of the couch, her shawl draped loosely around her shoulders, and gestured for me to sit. I did, careful at first to keep a small space between us. But the couch was narrow, and the storm outside had made everything feel more intimate than it should have. Our shoulders almost touched, the space between us filled with the faint warmth of her body. For a while we talked about nothing, the rain, the books on her table, the sound of the storm against the glass. But the words weren't the important part. It was the pauses, the way her voice softened when she asked me questions, the way her hand, resting lightly on her knee, tapped once as though she was holding something back. At one point she turned to look at me, and I swear the room shifted. Her eyes lingered on mine, steady, searching. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was charged, filled with a tension that pressed closer than any words could. I felt her hand move slightly, almost brushing against mine. My pulse quickened, and for a second I thought she might close the distance. But she didn't. Instead, her fingers lingered near, not quite touching, as if daring me to notice. The sound of the rain filled the room, and my own breathing seemed louder than it should have been. I wanted to reach out, to let my hand cover hers, to close the gap that had been pulling us together for days. But something held me back. Respect, hesitation, fear of breaking the fragile moment. She exhaled softly, her shoulders rising and falling. And though we never touched, The space between us felt electric, alive. That night, the storm outside wasn't the only thing that made my chest tighten. It was her, the nearness of her, the unspoken pull that neither of us dared to name. The storm had passed by the following evening, but the air still held its weight, damp, cool, and restless. I found myself on her porch again, though this time there was no excuse. I wasn't returning from errands or carrying boxes. I was just there because not being near her felt harder than explaining why I showed up at all. She didn't seem surprised when she opened the door. In fact, the faintest smile touched her lips, like she'd been expecting me. She stepped aside without a word, letting me in. Inside, the quiet was different from the night before. No storm to fill the silence, just the steady tick of a clock on the wall and the soft hum of her breathing. She settled into the armchair, tucking her legs beneath her, while I sat opposite her, unsure where to put my hands. For a while, neither of us spoke. It wasn't awkward silence, it was heavy, like both of us were holding words we didn't know how to release. Finally, she broke it. Her voice was low, steady, but fragile at the edges. "This shouldn't feel like this." I looked at her, my heart already racing. "Like what?" I asked, though I knew exactly what she meant. Her gaze met mine, unflinching. "Like more than it should. You and I, we don't fit the picture people expect." There it was. The truth neither of us had dared put into words. I felt my chest tighten. Not with fear but with the weight of everything unsaid. "But it does," I answered softly. The words slipped out before I could stop them. They weren't rehearsed, weren't polished, just the truth, plain and bare. Her lips parted, and for a moment I thought she might argue. Instead, she let out a quiet laugh. Not of amusement but of surrender. She leaned back, eyes closing briefly as if to steady herself. When she opened them again, they were softer, almost vulnerable. "You make it sound so simple," she whispered. I shook my head. "It isn't simple. But it's real." The silence that followed was thick, pulsing with everything hanging between us. My hands clenched against my knees, itching to move, to reach out, but I didn't. I waited, watching her, giving her the space to decide. Her eyes dropped to the floor, then back to mine. She shifted slightly in her chair, closer than before, as though her body betrayed what her words still held back. "You don't know what you're risking," she said, her voice quieter now, almost a confession. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, my tone low, certain. "Maybe not. But I know what I'd regret if I pretended I didn't feel this." For a long moment she just looked at me, as though weighing my words against every wall she'd built. Then the smallest, almost imperceptible smile curved her lips. Not playful, not teasing. Just honest. Neither of us moved to close the distance fully. We didn't need to. The shift had already happened. Something between us had broken open, and whatever came next, there was no going back to pretending. The days after that conversation felt different. Not louder or busier, just different. The air between us carried a new weight, like every word, every glance, every silence had been permanently altered. We hadn't crossed any lines, not physically, but something inside both of us had already shifted. A few evenings later, I found myself standing at her door again. This time I didn't knock. She'd left it slightly open, as though she knew I'd come. I hesitated for a moment, the kind of hesitation where you ask yourself whether you're about to make a mistake, or whether you're finally about to do the thing you should have done long ago. I stepped inside quietly. She was in the kitchen, pouring tea into 2 cups, her movements calm and practiced. She didn't look surprised to see me. Instead, she handed me a cup without a word, as if this was already a ritual between us. We sat by the window, the night outside pressing gently against the glass. The world was still, the only sound the faint clink of porcelain when we set our cups down. I wanted to say something profound, something that would untangle the knot inside me. But instead I said the simplest truth. "I don't know where this goes. I just know I don't want it to stop." Her eyes lifted to mine. For a moment she studied me the way she had that first day in the garden, as though she was measuring whether to let me in. Then slowly she smiled. Not the shielded kind, not the half-smirk she used to deflect. This was softer, real. "You're young," she said gently. Not dismissively, more like she was reminding herself of the facts. "And I've lived enough years to know how complicated this can get." I nodded. "I know. But that doesn't change how it feels when I'm with you." Her hand rested on the table between us, fingers tracing the rim of her cup. For a long moment, I just looked at it, debating whether to close the distance. Finally, I let my hand move across the wood, until my fingers brushed against hers. She didn't pull away. Instead, her hand turned slightly, her fingertips resting lightly against mine. Not a grip, not a claim, just contact. But it was enough to send a quiet shiver through me. We stayed like that, hands barely touching, eyes locked. There were no promises, no declarations. Just two people admitting that something had taken root, even if neither of us could name it fully yet. When I finally stood to leave, she walked me to the door. The air between us was warmer now, steadier. Just before I stepped outside, she whispered, almost to herself, "I told you not to look at me like that." I smiled, holding her gaze one last time, then stopped looking back. But she didn't. Not this time. Her eyes stayed on mine, steady and unflinching, as though she'd finally stopped pretending she wanted anything else. And in that silence, with no promises made, no futures mapped out, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever this was, it wasn't over.